I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and this is Mail Call Mondays, the show that answers your questions about precision rifles, optics, and equipment. We are here on this glorious Monday to talk about triggers. Now, we're not going to go into models and brands of triggers, but we're going to talk about two different types of triggers, the two-stage trigger and the single-stage trigger. The rifle in front of me here is an Accuracy International AX308. Now, anybody that's been around Accuracy International rifles for any amount of time knows that they come from the factory with a fully adjustable two-stage trigger. Now, a two-stage trigger is defined as a trigger with two separate trigger pulls built into it, or two separate phases of the trigger pull, if you will. What you have is an initial take-up and spring tension for the first stage of the trigger. The trigger will actually move and you will feel the spring pressure. You'll then feel the trigger stop. Now you're at the beginning of the second stage of the pull. Now, depending on the trigger you're working with, if it's a high-quality trigger, you will generally not have any more creep, any more movement of the trigger prior to the rifle firing. When you hit the beginning of that second stage, the trigger will just stop. Now all you're doing is building pressure against the face of the trigger until the rifle fires. Now once the rifle fires, you may have a little bit of over travel depending on how the trigger is adjusted or the type of trigger. I actually prefer a little bit of over travel because it gives us dirt clearance in the trigger. If we get mud and sand and stuff packed in there, you'll still have enough room to release that sear and fire the rifle. Now on a bolt action rifle, once you've fired the trigger, there's nothing else going on here. You actually have to move the bolt handle in order to reset the trigger. Once the trigger's reset, we start over. We've got that take up for the first stage, the spring pressure, then the stop for the second stage, and any further pressure will disengage the sear and allow the rifle to fire. Two-stage triggers, initially, when I started shooting precision rifles, I preferred single-stage triggers. I really didn't work a whole lot with the two-stage triggers. I just liked the feel of a single-stage trigger. However, as I started to shoot rifles in more inclement environments, more varied situations, I began to really like the added features that the two-stage trigger gave me. The key thing for tactical shooters and for professional shooters is that you'll have to shoot in all manner of situations, from burning hot to Arctic cold. In Arctic environments, this little trigger down here is metal. You have moisture in the pad of your finger. If you're in sub-zero temperatures and you place that warm, moist little digit on the bow of that cold, freezing trigger that's been outside and exposed to the wind and the ice and the snow for days, you're going to freeze the pad of that finger right to the face of that trigger. It's going to take that skin off when you pull your finger away, and if you have to have your finger engaged against that trigger for any amount of time, you're going to very quickly lose feeling in your finger. This is not a good thing. It's not conducive to accuracy. So what I suggest is, if you're in Arctic environments, make sure you're wearing contact gloves. You do not want skin on metal. If you have to wear any kind of glove, you really don't want that super light single stage trigger, because all you have to do is stick your glove in there and brush that trigger and off the rifle goes. So it's not a good situation to get into. With a two-stage trigger, you can wear something like ski gloves or even getting up into the Arctic mitts. And one of the features of the Accuracy International rifles is this nice large trigger well or trigger bow here, so that you can get that Arctic glove finger in there. Now once you get it in there, you can feel that you're moving the trigger backwards, so you know your finger's on the trigger. Pay attention. Now a two-stage trigger does not alleviate you from the responsibility to keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire. All it is an additional safety feature for a professional marksman or a shooter in Arctic environments. Now on the flip side of that, if you're in a situation where you're amped up and the adrenaline's flowing, your heart's racing, your breathing's ragged, and you need a shot downrange now, that two-stage trigger gives you that extra mental check in your brain. You know you're getting ready to send something downrange when you hit that stop. Again, it's not a safety. It does not alleviate you from the responsibility not to put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. It just gives you the extra mental speed bump that says, hey, this is what you're getting ready to do. So for the professional side, two-stage triggers are very nice to have. Now, when we switch over to the match rifle side of things, a two-stage trigger really allows you to run a lighter second stage than you would on a single stage trigger. The reason being is you have that take up before you trip that final stage. So for instance, if you're shooting offhand, you're shooting in an unsupported position, when you take your breath, you get set and you're ready to fire, you can take up that first stage and then hold the first stage while your wobble area is going around the bullseye. And when you're ready to press and that wobble area gets down to an acceptable size, then you can trip the second stage and not disturb your sight picture, not get a whole lot of other things going on. So you can run a very light second stage in a two-stage trigger and still maintain a margin of safety to where when you drop the rifle on the ground, it's not going to trip the trigger. And, you know, if you get a twig or something in there, it may not set it off. Those are the advantages of the two-stage trigger on a bolt-action rifle. Now, when we switch over to gas guns like our Armalite AR-10 here, equipped with an Armalite Tactical two-stage trigger, we have an added advantage on a semi-automatic rifle, especially when you get into the large 308s. When you fire that rifle, you have a whole lot of mass slamming back and forth inside the rifle. There is some movement in the rifle, and there is actually some forward movement when that bolt carrier slams closed. Because remember, you have a bolt carrier and a buffer in here that are all moving forward. And when they hit that barrel extension and close and the bolt locks into the barrel, it's like a slide hammer running forward into the barrel, and that will cause some forward press. If you are running a super light single stage trigger, you're going to have a double, because that rifle moving forward and your trigger finger being stationary is going to trip that trigger against that finger, and you're going to fire another round. There have been situations where guys have fired more than a couple of rounds and just gone into a bump fire and dumped a magazine. That is not a good situation. It's unsafe, it's a waste of ammunition, and it just makes you look like an idiot on the range. So a single stage, a very light single stage, is not a good thing to have on a semi-automatic rifle. Now, if you're one of those guys that wants a super light match trigger, then a two-stage is really the only way to go on these rifles, because again, it gives you that safety movement before you hit that light second stage. Then you can trip that light second stage, and when the rifle recoils, you have a longer distance to go to reset that trigger. So for semi-automatic rifles, a two-stage trigger is the way to go. I put two-stage triggers in all of my precision semi-automatic rifles just because that's what I prefer, that's what I'm ready for. Now, because I have them both in my semi-automatic rifles and my bolt guns, there is a continuity of training there. I know what to expect on each trigger. I actually had a situation recently where I went to a demo and was shooting rifles that were not something I was used to. And I'll go ahead and say it, this was an Accuracy International that was shooting, but it was something that somebody else had adjusted. And they had adjusted the two-stage trigger on that AI to be a single-stage trigger. I was not prepared for that because I had assumed, don't ever assume, especially when you're using firearms, I had assumed that I would be shooting a factory trigger, not an adjusted trigger. So I got down behind the rifle, got my sights on target, and began my trigger press, and as soon as I engaged the trigger, the rifle fired. Now, because I was observing proper safety discipline and I did not place my finger on the trigger until I was ready to fire the rifle, I actually still hit the target, but it wasn't something I expected to occur, and the rifle discharged a whole lot sooner than I had expected. So what I'm getting at on that is you need to keep in mind, if you have a mix of single stage and two-stage triggers, what you're shooting. Otherwise, you can get in a little bit of a sticky situation. And always, 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 always keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire. There's no reason for your finger to touch the trigger until your sights are lined up on the target. Even if you're some fast shooting cool guy, you still know you don't touch the trigger until your sights are on target. There's no speed advantage to doing it any other way. Trust me. Now let's talk about single stage triggers. The rifle in front of me is a Remington 700 set in a Whiskey 3 chassis system. We have installed a Timney 510 trigger in this system. The Timney 510 is a match single stage trigger. This trigger was ordered from the factory at 3.5 pounds, and it's pretty much right on that pull weight. Now, a single stage trigger, again, this rifle has been physically and visually verified that it's clear and the magazine is empty, so we are safe. On a single stage trigger, when you place the rifle on fire, the trigger is ready to go. The trigger does not have any forward or back movement. When you begin pressure on the trigger doesn't move. You just apply more and more and more pressure until you release the sear. Once the sear releases, depending on how the trigger is set up, you may have a little bit of over travel. As I said in the gas gun section of it, or as I said previously in the two-stage triggers, I prefer a little bit of over travel because a little bit of over travel gives me room for dirt or ice or snow or anything to get in there and still be able to release the sear. Now, because this is a bolt action trigger, once you fired the rifle, the trigger is dead. It doesn't do anything until after you operate the bolt. When you operate the bolt, that resets the trigger. The trigger is now ready to fire again. On a high-end match trigger, you should have almost no creep, no take up at all on the single stage triggers. Now, you may have just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit on some of them. This Timney is adjusted almost perfect. There is no take up at all on it, no creep, and as I said, only a tiny, tiny bit of over travel on it to allow a little bit of dirt clearance there. That is about perfect, in my opinion, for a single stage trigger. Pull weight at 3.5 pounds is right about where it needs to be. These are not bench rest rifles. You don't want to get down into that 2-ounce trigger pull on this kind of rifle. In bench rest, super light trigger pulls are the norm, and they're okay because what these guys are doing is they're setting their rifle unloaded into a rest, getting the rifle lined up on target, getting their crosshairs exactly where they want to hold. When it's their turn to fire, they'll set a cartridge gingerly into the chamber, they'll close the bolt, and then without touching anything else on the rifle, they'll place their shoulder behind the butt pad to catch the rifle when it recoils, and they will trip the trigger with as little pressure on it and as little disturbance on the rest of the rifle as possible. They need these super light trigger pulls in order to be able to engage that trigger without causing any other movement on the rifle at all, because they're not actually holding it. It's just sitting in the sled, and when it recoils, it's going to slide in the cradle. So, super light trigger pulls are the norm there. For those of us that are tactical shooters or precision rifle competitors, we are going to move with a loaded gun on some stages. You don't want this super light trigger. We're going to be transitioning, even if we're on the same firing point, we're going to be transitioning from target to target with a loaded rifle. You don't want to have your rifle fall over in the rifle discharge. You don't want to have your rifle bump against a barricade and have the rifle discharge. So a 3.5 pound trigger, in my opinion, is ideal for these kind of rifles on a single stage trigger. If you want to get down to 2.5 pounds, that's fine, but I would set 2 pounds as the concrete bottom limit of where you want a match trigger to be, match single stage trigger to be. Now, if we switch over and we go into the professional arena, a law enforcement shooter, you need to have the trigger pull up there a little bit higher. I would set 3.5 pounds as the minimum for where you want a law enforcement trigger to be. Check with the American Sniper Association. They have guidelines on where the trigger should be set. those guidelines will be defendable in court. That's what you need to be aware of on that. If you go monkeying around with your trigger and you dial it down to 1 pound and you have a shoot, you better believe that that's going to be brought up in court. It may be a completely lawful shoot, so you don't want anything that's going to distract you from that. So don't monkey around with super light triggers in working rifles. Now to wrap this up, my preference is for two-stage triggers. I like two-stage triggers. I like the advantages that they give you over the single-stage trigger. And they work equally well in bolt-action rifles and in semi-automatic rifles. I've learned this over time. I've eventually moved to where I usually use two-stage triggers. As you can see with my rifle in front of me here, I do still have some rifles with single-stage triggers. They work just fine. They're generally relegated to match rifles, and they're not something that I'm going to use in cold weather. If I'm going to use a rifle in cold weather, I much prefer a two-stage trigger on it. If I'm going to use a rifle when I'm amped up on adrenaline, I much prefer a two-stage trigger. Now, no matter what trigger you decide to install in your rifle, keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire. It doesn't matter if it's a single stage, two-stage, the world's greatest newfangled trigger. Keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire. This is a rule that applies no matter if you're a target shooter, a bench rest shooter, a law enforcement shooter, or a high-speed, fast guy kicking a door in, going somewhere to do something to bad people. Keep your finger straight and off the trigger until you intend to fire. Now, if you've liked this video, please make sure you click that thumbs up button. If you've got questions for us, go ahead and send it to us in the questions section below or on Facebook or Twitter. If you're a subscriber, thank you for subscribing. If not, please click that subscription button. It doesn't cost you anything, and we'll let you know when we release new videos. Until next time, get out and shoot!